Welcome to Shatter.
The joke landed during a family barbecue, the kind where everyone was already half laughing before the punchline arrived. We were standing in her sister's backyard, plastic cups sweating in our hands, music playing a little too loud. Emily was glowing the way she did in public, moving easily between people, touching shoulders, laughing at the right volume. I stayed where I usually stayed, close enough to be seen, far enough not to matter. Someone asked how work was going. Emily answered for me. She always did. She tilted her head, smiled, and said something about how I liked my spreadsheets and quiet routines, how I was reliable, how that worked out well because her job needed someone steady at home. Then she laughed and added that I was convenient. Not exciting, just convenient. It was framed as a joke. Everyone laughed the way people do when they're relieved it isn't about them. Her brother clapped, her sister shook her head, and her boss, Richard Hale, laughed the loudest. He was there because Emily had insisted. He stood too close to her, his hand resting on the back of her chair like it belonged there. He was polished, confident, the kind of man who filled space without trying, the kind of man who owned rooms. I didn't say anything. I felt the silence collect around me, heavy and visible. Emily glanced at me then, not with concern, but with calculation, as if measuring whether I would disrupt the flow. I didn't. I took a sip, nodded once, and let the moment pass. That seemed to satisfy her. The rest of the afternoon continued without me. Conversations shifted. Plates were cleared. Emily stayed near Richard, laughing at things I couldn't hear. At one point, she checked her phone and smiled at the screen in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months. I noticed her watching me from across the yard, her eyes sharp, waiting for a reaction that never came. When we drove home, the car was quiet. She talked about work, about opportunities, about how visibility mattered. I listened. I always did. She didn't mention the joke. She didn't need to. It had already done its work. That night, while she slept, I lay awake and stared at the ceiling. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't explain myself. I just stopped being where I was no longer respected. The first real crack didn't come from Emily. It came from someone who had no reason to lie to me and no interest in protecting her image. A colleague from her company, a woman I'd met once at a holiday mixer, reached out under the pretense of asking about a reference. The message was polite, neutral, and carefully worded. It mentioned restructuring, internal shifts, and how certain people seemed to be rising faster than expected. I read it once, then again. There was a sentence tucked in the middle that didn't belong. A line about how Richard Hale had taken a special interest in Emily's career path, how doors were opening that had been closed for years, how loyalty mattered more than performance in some rooms. It wasn't an accusation. It didn't need to be. The implication sat there, quiet and unmistakable. I didn't respond right away. I went to work, sat at my desk, and did what I always did. I looked at patterns, at sequences, at what changed and what stayed the same. When I came home that evening, Emily was energized in a way that felt new. She talked about meetings that ran long and dinners that were strategic. She mentioned Richard's name casually, as if repetition would dull its edge. I nodded, asked nothing, and watched her closely. She had started dressing differently. Subtle changes, nothing obvious. A new confidence in the way she moved through rooms. Her phone never left her side. Notifications came in late, and she smiled before hiding the screen. I didn't confront her. I didn't check her phone. I didn't need to. The shape of things was already clear. Later, while she showered, her laptop chimed from the kitchen table. The screen lit up with a calendar reminder synced to a shared work account. It wasn't explicit. It didn't have to be. Private meeting. Offsite. Same name. Repeating pattern. I closed the laptop without opening anything else. That night, Emily asked me if something was wrong. Not because she sensed distance, but because my silence had changed texture. It wasn't passive anymore. It was sealed. I told her I was tired. She accepted that answer too easily. From that moment on, I stopped occupying the space she assumed I would always fill. I listened more than ever. I paid attention. I noticed how often Richard's name surfaced when she talked about security, about protection, about the future. I noticed how rarely she said mine. By the end of the week, I wasn't confused. I wasn't angry. I was precise. And once precision sets in, movement becomes inevitable. I didn't go looking for proof in the dramatic sense. There was no need to dig through drawers or demand passwords. Evidence was already moving around me, careless and confident, assuming I would remain background noise. I just stopped filtering it out. Emily's schedule became erratic in ways that followed a logic she never explained. Mornings that started with urgency, evenings that stretched without warning, lunches that turned into closed-door meetings. She began routing certain expenses through a separate account we shared for work-related reimbursements, amounts rounded too cleanly, descriptions too vague. I noticed because numbers have habits, and these were trying too hard to look ordinary. One evening, she left her tablet on the couch when she went to shower. The screen lit up with a notification from an internal messaging system I recognized from my own consulting work. The preview showed Richard's name and a line about alignment and discretion. I didn't open it. I didn't need the details. The timing alone told me everything. Messages like that don't exist without context. And context, once established, doesn't disappear. At work, I started staying later, not because I had to, but because the office was quiet. I pulled public filings, internal press releases, and departmental budgets tied to Emily's division. Promotions were announced without explanation. Lateral moves that made no sense on paper suddenly made sense when overlaid with one constant variable. Richard's signature was everywhere, subtle but consistent. At home, Emily watched me differently. She sensed movement but couldn't locate it. I still cooked dinner. I still listened when she talked. I didn't accuse. I didn't withdraw. That confused her more than anger ever could. She needed friction to orient herself, and I offered none. One night, she mentioned Richard's name again, this time paired with a comment about how rare it was to have someone powerful willing to protect his people. She said it like a reassurance, like a value statement she expected me to share. I nodded once and said nothing. The silence didn't reassure her. It unsettled her. Later, alone, I reviewed our shared financials and made copies of everything that mattered. Not to use. Not yet. Just to know. Knowledge, when held quietly, has weight. It changes posture. It changes decisions. By then, the shape of the arrangement was unmistakable. It wasn't romance. It was leverage. Access traded for insulation. A controlled relationship built on mutual utility. I was no longer part of the structure. I was excess. That realization didn't hurt. It clarified. And once clarity arrives, the next step isn't confrontation. It's preparation. The decision didn't arrive with drama. It came quietly, like a switch flipping once all variables aligned. I waited for an ordinary evening, the kind that wouldn't register as important in her memory. Emily was distracted, moving through the apartment with her phone pressed to her palm, replying to messages that weren't meant for me. She mentioned a late dinner and didn't ask if I minded. I told her to have a good night. After she left, the apartment felt neutral, stripped of performance. I packed only what was necessary. Clothes that fit into a single bag. Documents I had already separated. My laptop. Nothing sentimental. Sentiment anchors people to places they shouldn't stay. I wiped my presence clean in small, methodical ways. Accounts deactivated. Cards frozen. Auto payments canceled. The shared calendar emptied with a few clicks. Before I walked out, I stood in the doorway and looked at the space the way an auditor looks at a closed file. No anger. No hesitation. Just finality. I locked the door behind me and didn't leave a note. Explanations are invitations to negotiate. I wasn't negotiating. By the time Emily returned later, I was already gone. I didn't see her reaction, but I imagined the sequence clearly. The unanswered call. The second one, faster. The way panic would surface not as fear, but as irritation at first. She would assume I was making a point, that I would return once she ignored it long enough. She always believed silence was temporary. From a distance, I watched the ripple spread. She called my office. She texted coworkers. She reached out to my sister under the pretense of concern. I didn't respond to any of it. My phone was quiet by design. Silence, when complete, becomes undeniable. I checked into a place that didn't know my name beyond what was required. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. In the morning, I went for a walk, observing the city as if I had just arrived. No one recognized me. No one expected anything. The anonymity felt deliberate, earned. Emily posted nothing online, which told me more than if she had posted everything. She wanted control of the narrative and had suddenly lost access to the subject. Richard's name would come up soon. He would step in. He always did. That was his role. I didn't interfere. I didn't explain. I simply stopped showing up where my presence had been reduced to utility. And once I was gone, the structure she relied on began to reveal its gaps. I didn't move against Richard directly. That would have been loud, inefficient, and traceable. Instead, I let gravity do the work. Structures like his rely on the belief that certain things will never be questioned. All they need is a small, well-placed shift. From my distance, I resumed habits that had nothing to do with Emily. I took on short-term consulting work under a different number, projects that intersected with compliance and risk analysis. Departments talk to each other even when they pretend they don't. Data moves. So do rumors, if you give them a path. I noticed irregularities in how Richard's department handled promotions and contractor approvals. Nothing criminal. Nothing dramatic. Just patterns that looked inefficient on paper and questionable when compared to internal policy. I didn't package them as accusations. I framed them as concerns, routed through the proper channels, stripped of emotion and intent. Documents don't need motives. They just need consistency. The response wasn't immediate. It never is. Systems resist until pressure accumulates. Meanwhile, Emily's attempts to locate me became less controlled. She reached out to friends I barely knew. She sent messages that started neutral and ended sharp. She asked if this was about the joke, about her work, about stress. I didn't answer any of it. At her office, things shifted subtly. Meetings were rescheduled. Approval slowed. Richard was still present, still confident, but the room adjusted around him. He began choosing his words more carefully. Visibility, the thing he valued most, became a liability. Emily felt it before she understood it. She mentioned over voicemail that work felt tense, that leadership was distracted, that things were in review. She said it the way people do when they're used to stability and sense it slipping. She still assumed Richard would insulate her. That was the miscalculation. I watched from the outside as internal inquiries multiplied, each one justified on its own. No single action pointed back to me. There was nothing to confront. That was the point. Influence doesn't require fingerprints if it's applied through process. One afternoon, a mutual acquaintance mentioned that Richard had canceled a series of public appearances. That told me everything. Men like him don't retreat unless the room has turned. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt alignment. I wasn't dismantling anything. I was allowing an imbalance to correct itself. Emily's leverage depended on his position, and his position depended on silence from people who understood systems better than optics. I remained unseen, unreachable, and steady. While she searched for control, I let the environment respond. And once it started, it didn't stop. The shift became visible in social spaces before it was acknowledged at work. That's always how it happens. Formal structures pretend nothing is wrong long after the room has already adjusted its posture. Emily's circle noticed first. A family dinner was scheduled, one she had tried to frame as concern rather than damage control. I didn't attend. My absence did the work for me. People asked where I was, and she answered with practiced vagueness. The explanations didn't land. They hovered, incomplete, inviting interpretation. Someone commented that it was unusual for me to disappear without a word. Another mentioned that stress usually makes people louder, not silent. No one accused her of anything. They didn't need to. Distance was accusation enough. At her office, the tone around Emily shifted. She was still polite, still competent, but the ease with which she moved through conversations was gone. Colleagues who once leaned and now leaned away. Invitations stopped arriving. Lunches became solitary. HR thrives on perception, and hers had changed without a memo to explain why. Richard's influence continued to contract. He was present less often, delegated more, and spoke only when necessary. The department adjusted to the vacuum carefully, testing how much of him still mattered. Emily's proximity to him, once an asset, became something people noticed for the wrong reasons. She left me a voicemail that evening, her voice controlled but strained. She said people were asking questions. She said things felt unstable. She said she needed me to talk to her, not as her husband, but as someone who understood systems. That distinction mattered. It told me exactly where I stood in her thinking. I didn't return the call. Later, I heard from her sister. The message was softer, framed as concern. She said Emily seemed overwhelmed, that she wasn't herself, that she kept checking her phone as if waiting for instructions. I listened and said nothing. Silence, when sustained, forces others to supply their own conclusions. By then, Emily was isolated in a way she had never been before. Not publicly shamed, not confronted, simply excluded from the spaces where certainty lives. People who sense instability don't ask questions. They create distance. I watched as her social presence thinned. Fewer photos, fewer updates. When she did appear, the comments were cautious, generic. Support without commitment. The kind that dissolves quickly. I didn't intervene. I didn't correct narratives or defend myself. I let the environment respond to the absence it couldn't explain. And as Emily lost the ability to manage how she was seen, the silence around her grew louder than anything I could have said. Isolation doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, disguised as temporary inconvenience. Emily treated it that way at first. She assumed people were busy, distracted, waiting for clarity that would arrive on its own. She kept moving as if momentum alone could pull the world back into alignment. From what I could see, she tried to rebuild access through the channels that had always worked. She reached out to colleagues under the pretense of collaboration. She attended events uninvited, smiling too deliberately, listening more than speaking. She adjusted her tone, softened her posture, recalibrated the version of herself she presented. None of it landed. The room had already decided to keep its distance. Richard was no longer the anchor she expected him to be. His responses became slower, his presence more controlled. Where he once offered reassurance, he now offered procedure. He didn't push. He didn't protect. He stayed within the boundaries that were closing around him. Emily noticed, but she didn't confront him. Power shifts make confrontation dangerous. She tried once more to reach me, this time through a mutual friend who framed it as concern rather than urgency. The message suggested a conversation, neutral ground, no accusations. It hinted at misunderstandings and timing. I didn't reply. By then, my silence wasn't avoidance. It was definition. I crossed paths with her unexpectedly one afternoon in a public space. She saw me first. I could tell by the way her posture changed before she turned. She didn't approach right away. She watched, measured, waited for a cue that never came. When she finally moved closer, it was with restraint, as if any sudden motion might push me further out of reach. She spoke carefully, avoiding specifics, referencing shared history without naming it. She looked for familiarity, for the reflexive response I used to offer. I listened without interrupting, my expression unchanged. I didn't validate or correct. I acknowledged her presence and nothing more. That moment did more damage than any argument could have. She needed engagement to re-establish footing. Indifference gave her none. When she walked away, it wasn't with anger. It was with uncertainty, the kind that lingers and multiplies. After that, her attempt stopped. Not because she found peace, but because she understood something had shifted permanently. I was no longer a participant in her system. I was an external variable she couldn't influence. I returned to my routines, my work, my quiet. The difference was that now it was chosen. And in that choice, I felt the distance between us widen into something she could see, but no longer cross. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no scene, no demand for answers. Emily reached out again, this time without intermediaries, without framing it as concern or logistics. She asked if we could talk. Not urgently, not emotionally, just a request, stripped down to its core. I agreed to meet in a neutral place where neither of us held history over the room. When she arrived, she looked composed in the way people do when they've rehearsed restraint. She sat across from me and waited, as if expecting me to open the exchange. I didn't. Silence forces priorities to surface. She began carefully, acknowledging the distance without naming its cause. She referenced stress, pressure, misalignment. She spoke about how things had escalated beyond her control. Richard's name surfaced once, then disappeared from her language entirely, as if omission could undo relevance. She framed events as external forces acting on her, not decisions she had made. I listened. I didn't interrupt or correct. I let her words occupy the space they created. When she paused, waiting for response, I didn't offer reassurance or judgment. I asked one question, quietly, about whether she understood why I had stopped showing up. Not why I left. Why I withdrew. She hesitated. That hesitation mattered more than any answer. It told me she had spent months managing optics without ever addressing cause. She spoke then about feeling unsupported, about needing stability, about how certain choices had seemed necessary at the time. Her language was careful, strategic, still oriented toward outcome rather than accountability. I didn't argue. I didn't explain my reasoning or outline my process. I told her that I had stepped away because I no longer recognized my role in her life as something grounded in respect. I didn't expand on it. I didn't justify it. I stated it the way one states a fact that doesn't require agreement. She asked if there was anything she could do to change that. The question was measured, but underneath it was urgency. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence do what it needed to do. When I finally spoke, it wasn't about conditions or reconciliation. It was about distance, about how some gaps, once established, don't close on command. I told her I wasn't angry. I wasn't punishing her. I had simply exited a position that no longer fit. She nodded, absorbing that. When we stood to leave, there was no resolution, no promise of another meeting. Just clarity. And as I walked away, I knew she understood that whatever came next would not be on her terms. The collapse wasn't immediate. It unfolded in stages, each one quieter than the last, which made it harder for anyone to intervene. Emily lost footing first at work, not her position outright, but the authority she once exercised without effort. Decisions she used to make were rerouted. Projects were reassigned. Her name stopped appearing on initiatives that mattered. She remained employed, visible enough to avoid questions, but sidelined in ways that couldn't be protested without drawing attention. Richard's presence faded further. He didn't disappear, but he no longer functioned as cover. His department underwent adjustments framed as optimization. Leadership shifted focus. His access narrowed. Emily's proximity to him no longer translated into protection, and that realization arrived too late to renegotiate terms. Socially, the change was sharper. Invitations stopped coming. Friends she once advised now kept conversations brief. Family gatherings continued without her taking center space. She attended, but differently, quieter, more watchful. People treated her with caution, not hostility. That was worse. Caution signals risk. I stayed removed from all of it. I heard updates indirectly, through acquaintances who didn't realize how much they were revealing. They spoke about Emily with concern, confusion, sometimes frustration. They asked if I knew what had happened to her confidence, her edge. I didn't correct them. I didn't add context. Absence had become my only statement. From a distance, I could see how the past resurfaced for her in fragments. Moments she had dismissed as predictable or dull reappeared under pressure. The way I handled logistics without comment. The consistency she never had to think about. The quiet support that didn't advertise itself. Those details gained weight only once they were gone. She reached out one last time, not to ask for reconciliation, but to acknowledge the loss of stability she had taken for granted. The message wasn't emotional. It was factual, almost clinical. She recognized now what she had miscalculated. I read it once and didn't respond. By then, my life had recalibrated. Work was steady. My routines were intact. I moved through my days without managing someone else's trajectory. The calm wasn't dramatic. It was structural. Emily's world, by contrast, felt provisional. Nothing collapsed loudly enough to draw sympathy. Nothing remained solid enough to lean on. That in-between state lingered, unresolved and visible. I didn't take satisfaction in that. I didn't need to. The outcome wasn't something I engineered for effect. It was the natural result of stepping out of a system that relied on my silence to function. And once I was gone, everything she had balanced on it began to slip. The last time I saw Emily, it wasn't planned. We crossed paths in a setting that didn't belong to either of us. A place where people pass without history attaching itself to the room. She noticed me and didn't pretend otherwise. There was no performance left in her posture. Whatever had once held her upright had thinned. She didn't approach immediately. When she did, it was slower than before, careful, as if she were stepping into uncertain ground. She didn't talk about work or family or what had unraveled since we last spoke. She talked about silence, about how it had followed her, about how rooms felt louder now that she had nothing solid to stand on. I listened without interrupting. I didn't correct her version of events or offer reassurance. She wasn't asking for either. She said she understood now that my absence hadn't been a tactic. It had been a decision. That distinction mattered to her in ways it never had before. She asked if I had ever planned to explain myself. The question wasn't accusatory. It was almost academic, like she was trying to map where things diverged. I told her I hadn't. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because explanations only make sense to people who are ready to hear them. She nodded, accepting that without argument. There was a pause then, the kind that invites emotion if you let it. I didn't. I told her I hoped she found stability again, but not at the cost of someone else's self-respect. I didn't frame it as advice. I stated it plainly. She didn't ask me to come back. That surprised me. Instead, she acknowledged what she had lost and why it couldn't be recovered by apology or proximity. That was the most honest thing she had said since the beginning. When we parted, there was no promise of contact, no lingering expectation. Just a shared understanding that something had ended cleanly, without spectacle. As I walked away, I didn't feel relief or triumph. I felt alignment. People later asked why I never told my side of the story, why I let assumptions stand. The answer was simple. I didn't disappear. I just stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. And once I did that, everything else resolved itself without my involvement. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.